Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on this National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. We'll get started in about 3 minutes, get everyone some time to get in, comfy, and while you're settling in, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, and organization. All right. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. So welcome to Centering Black Voices, a conversation on building a successful HIV Decriminalization Coalition rooted in racial justice. We're happy to have the founders of the Louisiana Coalition on Criminalization and Health, Robert Suttle and Mandisa Moore-O'Neill, and founding member Dorian Gray-Alexander with us today on National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. Again, if you're just joining us, please introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, pronouns, and organization. And yeah, let's get this party started. Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining me. And so I think for our first question, we want to lay the foundation of the work with LCCH. And so Robert and Mandisa, how did you all connect and what inspired the creation of LCCH?
I guess it starts with me. Honestly, it does. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone that's attending. 2011, I was shortly released from prison in a South Louisiana prison. I'm originally from Shreveport, which is the northwest part of the state. And so upon my release from prison, I wanted to find out more about HIV criminalization. And I should just add that if you don't know, I am someone that has experience or lived experience of HIV criminalization in the state of Louisiana. And unfortunately, I had to do jail time, 6 months in prison, and also was required to register as a sex offender in that state. for 15 years. And since my release from prison, I immediately started to wanting to learn more about this issue. I immediately went online and actually found a blog that really described the experience that I had. I didn't know anything about HIV criminalization, didn't know anybody that actually had experienced HIV criminalization. So it was just a whole new thing for me. And I needed answers as to why and how this was happening. And so I immediately connected with someone, the person that wrote that blog, who was a longtime activist. And that person actually was able to introduce me to, at the time, the Positive Justice Project, which is an initiative that had started in 2010, in the fall of 2010. And by the founder, Catherine Hansen, and I should add that the initiative is under the Center for HIV Law and Policy. And so, so through that initiative, I was able to learn about the issue, learn about the people at the time who were involved, which were a lot of policy people, lawyers, and just anyone that shared an interest in the issue. It was it's an issue that's been happening for some time prior to that, but it wasn't until around the 2010-ish and up till now that a lot of momentum and interest has been gained on this issue. And so to fast forward, Sean, the person that I connected with, he came to Louisiana to film me, to do what we wanted to call a short film or a documentary at the time called HIV Is Not a Crime. And so it was the first time I met Sean in person. It's the first time I was able to sort of share my story publicly through that medium of a short film. And since then, we had shared the film globally at a high level policy meeting, but we were bringing it back to the states. And with me being from Louisiana and Sean having connections in Louisiana, we were able to host small community forums or just small little settings where we were able to show the film for the first time, just to get a little buzz and interest around this issue. And so I think that's really how I first met Dorian, perhaps, but then also shortly after meeting Mandisa in 2012, because we had started the Zero Project and just started connecting, especially in Louisiana, just connecting with people, sharing the film, having community forums. And I can't remember the exact events that they were, but I know I met Mandisa for the first time. And but I may have met Dorian first and then Mandisa shortly thereafter, because it was like 2011, 2012. So it's all kind of comes together there. But that's really how I initially connected with Dorian and Mandisa. So I'll let them.
I remember the day that I met Robert. And Dorian, I don't remember the day that I met you, but I remember meeting you. And actually it was at the same place, because like Dorian's been an organizer and an activist like since I, met you in New Orleans. So I, I'm not somebody living with HIV. So at best, I'm somebody who spends my time trying to be in support, of the well-being and justice of people who are living with HIV. And to that end, I was a law clerk at this organization called AIDS Law of Louisiana. AIDS Law was like a state group, a state organization, statewide organization that worked on the legal needs of people living with HIV. So I was a law clerk and then a staff attorney. So in 2012 was the year that I graduated law school, and I was waiting on bar results. So I'm in the office still as a law clerk because I'm not yet a staff attorney. And one of our attorneys comes like, there's this guy, he has this amazing story. He wants to meet us and share his video. And I'm like, okay. And that's when I met Robert, because like you came in and talked about your experience. And it was the first time I had heard the term HIV criminalization, though I had clients who had experienced or who were being threatened with possibly being arrested. I just didn't have the terminology. You know what I mean? So like talking to you was like, oh, this is a thing. It has a name. Folks are organizing around it. Wow.
Yeah. So I actually met Robert, I think the weekend that he had come down to New Orleans to do the film. And then shortly thereafter, the film HIV is Not a Crime was shown, and it really did spark my interest in getting to be involved in this more. So at that point, Louisiana was sort of, we knew there was a statute, and we had seen or met someone who was abused by that law, and now it was a chance for us to begin to approach it. And so that is when I got more involved in this, and also through a prior advocacy group, which is probably how I met you, Mandisa, because I think for like the 2012 sessions, we actually went up to Baton Rouge and began to have more legislative awareness, and so that was the beginning of where things are now.
And so to answer your other part of your question, Kytara, in terms of like how this inspired LCCH, there are times I've come back and forth to Louisiana, whether it's through speaking to public health staff workers or whatever the invite was. I would come down and share about my experience of HIV criminalization. And so that's within the state of Louisiana, but nationally, the Suttle Project, which is again an organization that we started in 2012, was also growing as well. So you have Suttle, we have the Positive Justice Project. So we're kind of on the same path, but all sharing interests around this issue and doing work. And so in 2014, Suttle Project was able to, along with other national advocacy organizations of people living with HIV, were able to host the first ever HIV is Not a Crime conference in 2014. And so that conference was a 2 to 3 day conference that brought together all people living with HIV from across the country for the first time to talk about this issue. And so in terms of the landscape, Iowa at the time was I believe the first state that had sort of organized around this issue, and they were also instrumental in getting some significant changes to their state law. And so that inspired a lot of things. It inspired the fact that, wow, if we can formulate coalitions, there's this possibility that we're able to, change the law, which is when people hear this issue, this is the first thing they want to do. They want to change the law. What can I do? How can I get invited? And so Iowa in some way was a model of what could be done. And so it was just a matter of deconstructing, like, how do you do this? How can this happen? And so that pretty much is part of the HINAC, or the HIV is Not a Crime Training Academy experience, is that the delegates come to the conference or the training. We go through all the talks, discussions, and things, and then we go back to our various states and figure out how to organize. And so that is sort of, I guess you can say, what inspired it. And the next step from there was that there was a stigma summit that was being held in Louisiana in 2016. And so I of course wanted to start a coalition in Louisiana quite naturally because I am from there and all the things. And so we took advantage of this opportunity to come down to Louisiana and decide, okay, how do we do this? How do we maximize or capitalize on the fact that there are people meeting in the state capitol in Baton Rouge? And how do we ask them to stay over for another day or two, for a day and a half, of just coming together, organizing, discussing it. Where do we start? How do we do this? Do we want to do this? And where do we do this? And so it was strategic. I had, from 2012 to 2016, I had come back and forth to Louisiana. So I was able to connect and identify certain people within community that I thought would be good to bring into this space. And so that's pretty much what sort of inspired LCCH was just basically the fact that what happened in Iowa in terms of the coalition work, and then taking advantage of this opportunity of everyone being in one space at one time in Louisiana. And so invites were sent, people responded back, and we began to logistically organize so that people could have a smooth transition from that HIV Stigma Summit in Louisiana coming into sort of this Louisiana strategic planning meeting to sort of formalize the beginnings of LCCH.
Thank you for sharing that, Robert. I think it's important because, like most people outside the state, think of Louisiana and of New Orleans. And this meeting was actually in Baton Rouge. You know what I mean? Like, which at the time, Baton Rouge and Shreveport had the highest number of arrests, based on the intentional exposure statute. So I think it was important that it not be in New Orleans. Something else, like for context, Louisiana had a HIV/AIDS advocacy organization, LAN, which was Louisiana AIDS Advocacy Network, but LAN never really focused on HIV crim. I don't think LAN was opposed to it. I think there were just other issues like Medicaid expansion, prior to 2016, so those 6 years between when it passed and when we finally got it, and issues like that. But I remember being excited to have been invited to this meeting in 2016 because it was clearly folks who were involved in HIV advocacy, and to finally have a group of folks who were going to throw down as far as HIV crim in Louisiana felt very exciting. And, as somebody who at that point was very, very locally based, I was aware of the work and the advocacy and the organizing in Iowa. And I was hopeful that we could use Iowa as an example. And I was hopeful that we could go further than Iowa. You know what I mean? And I say that acknowledging that, as somebody from a deep South state, I know that it's hard to get any kind of reform. So I'm speaking on Iowa, not in a way of disparaging, knowing how hard these fights are, but also like, okay, what can we learn from Iowa's fights in order to figure out, is it possible in Louisiana, like to do something like that goes a bit more? Because for me, even though like who I work with, like the orgs I'm a part of have changed, I've always had the same goal, and that's ending arrests, prosecutions, criminalization. Like that has never changed. And so it's always been, okay, well, how do we do that? Who can we talk to that has done something similar? Like what can we learn? And that's what I remember like about that room. It was when With the Vision was there. In fact, Laura McTighe is the one who facilitated that session in 2016. Catherine Hanson's our founder at CHLP. She was in the room. It was you and Sean from Cerro, but it was mostly local groups. Like I said, it was With the Vision, and it was folks who weren't necessarily tied to an organization, and that's what I really loved about that group. Dorian, you were there.
Yes, I was there. It was a scary time because like we were beginning to come together and to focus around what this law means. How can we get this law changed? What does that change feel like, smell like, taste like? And what would be the best approach? Is it to just repeal the law and what those risks are? Or do we reform the law in some way to make it less biting and also less applied to people? Some of the challenges we had at the time was that a lot of folks with HIV really didn't know the impact of what that law could mean, and also felt like, well, people should tell their status, folks should disclose, and if you don't, well, then that is wrong. It's morally wrong. It's ethically wrong, and so changing the mindset of folks really began there to help folks to see that criminalizing someone because they have a manageable virus is just wrong. Now, how do we do that? What were the next steps? And that's a large part about LCCH, and also to develop what core principles we hold true in doing this work.
Y'all are preceding me in the questions. And so I want to step back a little bit. And so you have this summit in Baton Rouge, and then you are going to make this transition into like LCCH, the strategic coalition. What guided your decisions about who to include in that space?
Yeah, to Dorian's point about mindset, because although I met all these various people, or maybe had a name of someone that based probably just their position in terms of whatever the advocacy or role that they were playing in the work. So I was very, in some ways, strategic and intentional, but also taking a risk too, because I didn't know everyone's mindset around this issue. But I know that as I was coming back and forth from Louisiana, I remember someone putting me on to Dion. I didn't know Dion prior to my experience. And so people were able to connect me to people that were influential, or people who had some standing or some interest or connection to doing decrim work in regards to whatever the issue was. And so I was taking notes, basically, taking notes and paying attention and being mindful. And so, as Mandisa pointed out, some of those people were connected to organizations, but then there were a lot that were not. They were just independent advocates or independent people living with HIV that just wanted to be in the space. So I think we had up to 25 people. So I was intentional with a certain number of people, and also looking at budget too. But we had at least up to 25 people in this space to come together. So to me, looking back now, I'm like, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. The people showed up and they were committed to that day and a half of just coming together, sharing our thoughts and feelings about this experience, about this issue. And so I like to think that we left there with a sense of like, that this was something that needed to be done. It was just sort of what's the next step? Because we do want to do this, and people left with what they would commit to. But again, life happens, things change. And so you just try to figure out how to move through sort of the uncertainty of something that you haven't done before, around an issue you haven't dealt with before, because we're talking about decriminalizing it. And so we were, it was a big challenge, and so over time, we eventually stayed together. I think there was a core of us that were able to stay together and just continue to move forward. Up till this present moment.
Thank you for naming that. Like, I remember that we didn't even have a name for like the first maybe almost 2 years. Like, I remember us like voting on what the name would be. I think for the first like year and a half, 2 years, it was just like the decrim folks. Like, we were all on a listserv and we met monthly on like freeconferencecall.com or something like this, like pre-Zoom times, which ironically was kind of good during COVID in terms of some groups had to pivot from in-person to virtual, whereas like we always met, via phone or virtual. So for us, it wasn't, a pivot, but also thinking about how like we didn't even have a name, but like we all had a shared vision of what we wanted and didn't want, but also thinking of what Dorian said about it was about education. I think sometimes folks often join a coalition or like, we need to move now, we need to introduce a bill, we need to do something. And I think we all understood that urgency, like, like given that folks were still being arrested, like we would all see the headlines. We often knew the people, who were being criminalized. And we also saw the comments and we also saw the headlines and saw like the layers upon layers of miseducation. And I still believe it was the right thing, like for us, like to go slow and to spend those early times trying to educate and engage more of our people, because so many people, and I'll speak for people not living with HIV, didn't know, either didn't know it was an issue or thought, oh, well, this makes sense, people should be in jail or whatever. So that was important. And I think that's what made 2018 so hard, because like that's when, this is recorded, so I'll keep it cute, but like a well-meaning lawmaker in Baton Rouge chose to introduce legislation. And I'm saying well-meaning to be clear, his impact was actually very harmful. But I'll say maybe his intent was meant to be, good. But like that was really challenging for us because we were still in our education phase and didn't plan on having to fight, a bill, of somebody who could have actually been an ally. Like this guy was also introducing things like trying to make wages better across the state and trying to have more worker protection. So really, he's somebody, if he had been open to hearing us, he could have been an ally. But instead, because he didn't want to check his own biases around people living with HIV and his own assumptions that us people who are negative often have, he didn't see that his bill was harmful. And I think about how that was like 2 years after we had started. And for us to have to go from just getting started, like had just gotten a name at that point, to having to fight that all unpaid, because like LCCH just started getting funding in 2022. So for the first 6 years, like I say it was freeconferencecall.com because it was freeconferencecall.com. All of us had our own day jobs and, spent this because it was a passion. Last thing I will say is I remember also ACLU of Louisiana was at that initial meeting, and they were very involved early on. And like in the role like that Williams Institute now plays for us, at first ACLU played that role of trying to track the arrests across all 64 parishes. And again, like thinking of these external factors, I think about 2017, 2018, they lost a shit ton of funding, as who was president at that time. That was a major shift in terms of now we didn't have a state group who understood parishes, who understood our processes, who was able to try to get that information. And so it meant for a number of years, like we didn't have an entity who had the capacity and time to like gather those kind of like that kind of data. So like until Williams. So Williams was important. And I also want to highlight it was people in the state who were trying to gather that kind of information as well.
Right. And Louisiana is a poor state in the deep South, and as we know, a lot of poor people are often Black and brown people, and also women. And so so at that time, it was challenging in wanting to create this big bus, a coalition, which is hard to wrestle because you want the door open so that folks can get on the bus and drive the bus. And there were also concerns among some people about taking that bus and running some folks down, like people who work for sex. They want to exclude them from any protections that might be done here in the law. So it's creating a coalition among any oppressed or marginalized group of people is a challenge because we have competing priorities. We have people who are interested in not just keeping the cause going and also alive, but there are also those out there who want to take that power away. So it's been a challenge, and even as you get things going, then it becomes about, so how do we maintain the momentum? How do we keep people engaged? How do we bring more folks into the fold to help them help themselves and also to help push things forward? So, in our time remaining, I hope that we can sort of, use what we did in Louisiana to help the folks across the country to see that it can be done, and that it can be done with Black and brown faces.
Awesome. Dorian, you mentioned, with your bus metaphor, that there are sometimes groups with competing interests who would run over certain other groups. And so with that, what were some core values or priorities that you refused to compromise on when you were starting?
Well, one, that it was important that all people living with HIV deserve to not be at risk of being arrested or in jail because they had HIV. And at the same time, remember, viral suppression, which is vital to us all. There had been some administrative changes to the law in other states that in large part said, well, if you're virally suppressed, you can't get charged with this law in our state. And it's like, well, that's really not okay, because not all folks can become virally suppressed. So stuff like that. So it was important that we include all people living with HIV, regardless of their health status. How do we then begin to bring in the concepts of U equals U, which is undetectable equals untransmittable, without creating a second class of people that this law really needs to help and apply to. So I'm going to ask Mandisa and also Robert to recall what else was going on, and also how we achieved or arrived at the values that we now have.
We actually drafted a value statement, you know, because like, and I don't remember like the exact time, but it was very early on. And I'll be honest, I was one of the people who pushed for that, because I think all of us, you know, had experiences in coalitions where like we're doing this work and then it comes out we don't have shared values. Like when like at this moment where suddenly two people like, you know, let's compromise, let's make it, you know, you equals you, and the other people are like, nah, we not with that. So I was trying to like, again, learn from the things from other coalitions about how do we have these shared values and principles that we all understand, and even if we don't embody them at this moment, are working to learn how to embody them, because we're all, you know, in a process of learning and really unlearning. And as Dorian said, that was one. Like another value and principle was, oh, and to be clear, LCCA still has these, like it's been updated to reflect 2025, but they're still, you know, in practice. Like that was one. Like the second one was valuing lived experience. And for me, as somebody not living with HIV and a lawyer, that was very important, because how many times have we been in spaces where I get seen as an expert when someone like Dorian or Robert are not, only because I have certain letters and went to school and all these things. So how do we value lived experience as the center, and then put the data and the research as something that supports lived experience? That was an important value. Then also being that like we did have national organizations in the coalition, how do we also value people living in Louisiana? Because I know after Katrina, as a New Orleanian, I really experienced people come in with their, you know, I know better than you backwards Southerners, and I'm going to tell you how to save yourself. And, you know, after those funding dried out, we were left holding the bag of these half-finished projects. So trying to avoid that, gag it, you know, it's true, Dorian. So like having something like that, while it's important to have folks at the national, you know, and regional level supporting, that we are still grounded in the lived experience of folks in this state, especially people who are Black, people who are brown, people who are queer, people who are trans, people who use drugs, because we know those are the folks in Louisiana who are not only criminalized overall, you know, whether it be sex work, drugs, anything, but especially around the issue of HIV criminalization. So it was important like that be said in the values, because, you know, to me, it's also like a tool of accountability, right? Like if I'm doing something that, you know, I'm the expert because I'm a lawyer, I've agreed to these values. So Dorian can say, hey, Mandisa, you are in alignment with the values. Like how do we come back to this place where we are in alignment? So it's good to have publicly, externally facing, but also internally as a tool of accountability, like for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are like two or three of the main shared values that we have. Also shared values that in terms of healing justice, because we also recognize people are going through so much trauma on so many different levels. And we also the fundamental right of people to have to experience pleasure. You know, that's something that we also addressed on the table early on. So we really was trying to go deep, you know, really go deep and dig deep here, so that we know the kind of people that we were, I guess, collectively working with and, you know, who's in the room. And also these were things that matter to the people that were in the room. And so we just wanted to be able to honor and respect and acknowledge that and carry all of that forward, you know, as carry it all the way forward as we move together.
Yeah, and certainly we don't all have the same experiences. We don't always agree. We may struggle in trying to achieve a unified voice. That's not easy, but I think a shared value is that we do want to hear from everybody in the room, and that we want to value what they bring forth about what their experiences are. People in the cities in New Orleans don't have the same experiences as someone who is in a more rural setting. People who have constant access to housing, work, food, don't have the same experiences whenever that is not there for someone. What is difficult is getting established systems to be a part of this and not try to take it over. And so, I think that the coalition has done and continues to keep its autonomy while at the same time being very aware and also appreciative of any support that we get from local, state, and national support.
And just also the bottom line is that we weren't interested in leaving nobody behind, no matter where they came, their identity, their background. As far as community, we were not interested in leaving anybody behind. So just again, carrying that with us as we move forward was important.
Great. Y'all have actually moved beautifully and seamlessly through my questions. And so I'm gonna skip to our last question, which is, how did the initial years of the coalition inform the structures and practices of the coalition? And kind of like doing the initial, but then how we see LCCH today as well. And I'll let y'all fight for who wants to speak.
I'll give it a stab. I would say that what we were talking about earlier was pretty much tied to our first strategic meeting. But since then, LCCH has had other, I think at least two or maybe three, at least two or three more strategic planning meetings. And so I like to think that they were able to build from the first meeting and then the second one and maybe the third, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe the first to the second, and just really taking those things forward. And as Mandisa pointed to, just really making it relevant to the present time, because it's been a decade, almost a decade now since the start of the coalition. And so I think that has been instrumental. And then two, finding, they have a steering committee, people that have been committed, some since day one that were a part of the meeting, and then new people that have come on. And even myself had been on, and Mandisa has had moments to be on the steering committee. And so it's been great to just see how they've been able to just take those things and use it in the current organizing. And also we have a great coordinator now that we were able to, that most of the people in the community, from my perspective, knew and had a relationship with. And so that was someone that I was able, and I'll give the person a name, Dietz. Dietz was someone that I did know, but everyone in the community did. And they also, Dietz had the best skill set at that time of the candidates to really get in this coordinator seat and really help move the coalition forward along with the steering committee, and as well as the people that were interested, in being part of the coalition. And so it has definitely grown since 2016 in ways that I couldn't be more proud of. And so those are just a few observations that I'll let Mandisa and Dorian speak.
So yes, I mean, you know, we've spent a lot of time about where things were in the past. What is great is that with the advent of funds, a lot can change. A lot did change, and so having a full-time coordinator really does help change the whole game, because it allows for the continuity to be there, the support to be there. It has been absolutely critical. So in the past 3 years, or almost 3 years, we have dabbled in legislation in a very different way. We have a lot more coordinated efforts, and that really helps a great deal. And it helps to have really good leadership whenever that's in place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's clear that like we really learned from what happened in 2018, where we were again like 2 years into fighting a bill. And while, you know, I'm very proud of like the fights like that we put up, in terms of it really did change like a lot of discourse. Like I don't think folks had really talked a lot about what affirmative defenses are, and you know how challenging they are, like in the implementation, like how rarely it's used. I also think it was a chance like to really confront how there's this misconception that these laws keep women and femme people safe. You know what I mean? So having like the largest sexual assault group in the state come out against us, and then us being able to take that and see opportunities like to build and like have conversations about how these laws keep women actually like even more unsafe. You know, like it was all things like that were super important. I'm also thinking of 2021, where we had to fight against the bill to criminalize more STIs, you know, in the middle of a pandemic, and like, you know, and all of what that meant. And by about 2021, it was clear to all of us that we had really kicked the question of funding down so much. It was time to finally answer it. Like, are we going to get funding? How are we going to do it? Because being that we were all volunteer, it meant that, you know, when our paid jobs have a certain kind of capacity, that means that we then have to pull back from the coalition and things like that. And so I think that was one of the best decisions like that we ever made as a coalition, was, you know, like choosing like to get funding, though that always opens up its own cans, because then like you're suddenly now accountable to a funder who maybe isn't always understanding what's happening on the ground in Louisiana. But that's a risk like that we take when we, you know, engage, you know, in the funding world. And then also like having Deets, who I don't think is actually full-time, but just works and does so much that you probably think that he is full-time, but Deets can answer that. But, you know, I think like that meant that last year we were ready to introduce a bill in a way that I think if we were still volunteer, it would have made that so much more challenging. And I don't think it would have had the momentum that it did have, you know. So last thing I will say is that's something else that I hope folks who are either new into coalitions or are thinking of revamping, like, are able to consider. Be intentional, like, about how you go about funding. I think oftentimes in this nonprofit world, like, we're told once you have an idea, you have to become a 501c3 and you have to get funding and you have to do this. And you don't necessarily have to do it that way. Think about what's strategic for your organization and your work. And I think that's what we did. And when it became strategic for us, that's when we thought, and acquired funds like to bring on, more people. And also like being able to question, would that take away from like the work that we're doing if we suddenly are spending time trying to get funds? So I think that's something that I'm always thinking about as far as LCH as well.
Thank you. And so we got 10 minutes left. So we're going to transition to our Q&A. We already got a question for you, Robert, from Shakina. Can you talk more on healing justice that you mentioned earlier?
Healing justice is a practice. I can't say that I've done healing justice work. At least I've not proclaimed that I have, or maybe been a part of it, but I do believe in it. I do support it. But I think if I just give a comment to Shakina's question, I think it is important because I do recognize that harms are done on so many levels, in so many ways. And so people want their harm to be recognized. They may not fully support someone being totally criminalized or prosecuted, but they want their harm to be recognized. And that is so important. And in this instance around HIV criminalization, as much attention is put on the persons being accused of exposing or perhaps bringing harm to someone, the person who also the other person who may bring the charges or bring the accusations, or they've experienced some sort of harm. And so it's so important that we acknowledge that together and as advocates doing this work, because as much as the state does this thing, they're going to do their thing, but they're not coming back and saying, you know what, we're sorry that you experienced that, or at least allow the community to find ways to come together and address it to them, how they feel about the harm that's being done by the state. And so there's enough harm to go around, and we just have to acknowledge that. And I hope I've given some insight to healing justice. So as I said, I haven't publicly proclaimed it, but I do support it and I do understand it.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, and this is a big one, how do you all think things will play out now on criminalization with the new president?
I mean, well, it's not only like the president that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about his best friend, who's the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, who actually has implemented some of the policies right here in Louisiana that are now being implemented on a national stage. So, for example, several months ago, we had memos as far as the state health department had essentially been gagged from talking about any vaccines. Fast forward to now when we're seeing federal health departments are also being gagged in terms of talking about life-saving information. So it's not that I'm not concerned about the president, because obviously he's going to have an impact on whatever happens in any state. But in Louisiana, after 8 years of a Democratic governor who certainly had his flaws, but was the first state in the South to expand Medicaid, which had a really big impact on many of our people, being able to have Medicaid. Also, under his tenure, a slew of criminal legal reforms were passed that he signed, into law. So just thinking about after 8 years of that, and now we have Jeff Landry, that's also is what I'm thinking about, in terms of how strategic are we going to have to be in order to do the kind of state law work that criminalization, is, so that's what I'm thinking about. But again, I'm not trying to say that I'm not worried. I just know like that we have been thinking about this for some time, and I look forward to being a part of the innovation of how we do things. Like I know last year, it was a lot of conversations with the state prosecutor's office. I know that those conversations are, is going to continue. I think that's going to make a big deal when we introduce bills in the future. And so I think like that's an example of the kind of innovation that I feel very confident in LCH and in CHLP and being a support of. And it's going to require healing justice at every step, because it's going to have to be us, taking care of ourselves because of the vitriol that is going to be happening at the federal and state level. So how do we do the work, but also, take our water, take our breaks, take our rests to sustain ourselves, like along the way, because it is going to be and has been quite the uphill battle.
Yeah, and what concerns me is the cleansing and the erasure of all the work that's been done on the federal level to help support people living with HIV, but also to bring a lens on the damage and the danger of HIV criminalization laws. The Department of Justice had been supportive in saying that these laws need to be repealed. It's very likely that could be reversed or just entirely erased. And that's a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal to get that done. And if it gets rolled back, it just makes the work harder to do when you're facing such change that we don't know where, when, or how, and any federal legislation seems less likely to be introduced or else passed. It's going to be really important for folks to get out and vote, to continue to call their elected officials and say, I'll support your no vote against someone. I will support you to vote yes for these things that are important for folks of trans experience, for folks who are living with HIV. We're going to soon have a budget coming from Congress that we have no idea what is in it, what is left in it, or what is being removed. So I think it's important for us all to be very aware and engaged and as vigilant as we can be.
And I would add that it's important to see how public health in the states, are they drawing the line and say, okay, enough is enough. We know what can kill people in terms of viruses, diseases, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a trying time for public health to see are they going to stand on the side of community and advocacy, or are they going to just continue to maintain the status quo and allow more criminalization to take place as it relates to HIV and any other communicable diseases.
Thank y'all for taking on that huge question. We have just come up to the end of our webinar. I have learned a lot and about the formation of LCCH, the the work and the care and love that was put into the formation of what is now LCCH. And yeah, so I want to thank Mandisa, Robert, Dorian for taking time out on your Friday to speak with everyone. As you can see right now on the screen, we have a QR code if you would like to join our Positive Justice Project email list to learn more about our HIV criminalization work. You can also email us at that email, which goes directly to me. So I get to see it. And yes, thank you all who are in attendance today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event or any other events. And the last word is keep on fighting, because that's all we can do.
Thank you for moderating.
Oh, of course, it is a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.